Hello, I'm Betsy Johnson, Assistant Curator at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. This afternoon, we welcome artist Diana Al-Hadid in conversation with Charlotte Burns as part of the museum's virtual artist talk series, Talking to Our Time. This afternoon's program is a collaboration between the Hirshhorn Museum and the Art and Embassies program at the U.S. State Department. Since 2017, our two institutions have hosted talks with internationally renowned contemporary artists such as Pat Steer, Nick Cave, Imran Qureshi, and Vic Muniz. We have many ways to stay connected to art and artists virtually at hirshhorn.si.edu. We hope you'll join us for future online programs and that you will join our mailing list to be the first to know about upcoming programs and exhibitions. Now I'd like to welcome Imtiaz Hafiz, Acting Director of the State Department's Art and Embassies program, who will introduce today's speakers. Hello.
Betsy, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here representing Art and Embassies. In 1963, President Kennedy formalized Art and Embassies as an office of the State Department. Since that time, AIE has played a leading role in US public diplomacy, creating exhibitions and outreach programs for US diplomatic missions worldwide, with the goal of encouraging cross-cultural dialogue and understanding. We at Art and Embassies are proud to partner with the Hirshhorn to present this series of artist discussions. If you're with us for the last one with Jorge Pardo and Rafael Dominic, you know that they produce stimulating conversations that engage and connect us. I'd now like to introduce the next artist in the series, Diana Al-Hadid. Diana was born in Aleppo, Syria, raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Among her many honors include prestigious grants from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Pollock Krasner Foundation. She is a USA Rockefeller Fellow and in 2020 received the Academy of Arts and Letters Art Award. Her works are a balance between painting and sculpture, the imagined and the real. They draw inspiration from science, literature, history, and architecture. We in AIE are honored that Diana created a new work for the US Embassy in Pristina, Kosovo. Her work, Words from Mountains, installed in 2018, was inspired by the historic stone bridge in Prizren, Kosovo. Diana will be in conversation today with Charlotte Burns, executive editor of In Other Words, a series of weekly newsletters and podcasts about the art world and art market put out by Art Agency Partners. Welcome, Diana and Charlotte, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Imtiaz, and thank you, Betsy. And hello and welcome to At Home on Art and the Improbable, Artist Talk with Diana Al-Hadid. Thank you, Diana, for taking part. Thank you to the Hirshhorn and to Art and Embassies for hosting us, and to you, our audience, for joining us. Before we begin, just a few brief housekeeping notes. For the purposes of this webinar, we've muted all attendees since there are so many of us, but feel free to send your questions during the talk using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end. Now for more on our guest. Following on from that introduction there, Diana is known for her richly layered work, her intricate installations, and her innovative, technically adventurous use of materials. Born in Syria in 1981, her family moved to Ohio when she was 5 years old, and she knew she wanted to be an artist by the time she was 11. She would go on to receive an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2005, and then attend Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2007. Major exhibitions include Fates at the Vienna Succession in 2014, where two of her most prominent figures, Hans Memling's Allegory of Chastity and Gradiva, first appeared together. These two figures have appeared in many forms since, including Diana's solo show at Madison Square Park in Manhattan in 2018. Another notable commission was the one for the US Embassy, as Imtiaz just mentioned, and another work, Nolly's Orders from 2012, was named by ArtNet News as one of 100 works that had defined that decade. So, where to begin? I thought we'd begin with a question about where we are right now. Obviously, during the pandemic, Diana, you've been having to work in a different way. I know you've been spending less time in your studio and more time upstate and including making work outside. How has all of this impacted your practice?
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much for your question. And thank you, the Hirshhorn, for having me in my own space, but for hosting this event. So yeah, I'm currently in the office of my studio, but I have been spending more time upstate, out in nature. We were fortunate enough to buy a place just the year before the pandemic hit. So we were able to take shelter there and, my kid run around outside. There's some, I think some clear shifts in the work recently that are probably more tangible than others. I've noticed that my work's gotten more colorful. It actually has gotten more, there's a lot more like greens and blues, which might have just been from being outside more. I don't know. It's hard to, it's really hard to track exactly where these things come from. But I've caught the planting bug, the gardener's bug, like a lot of people this year. And there are just some probably more intangible things that have affected me like everybody else. I mean, we're all obviously living through this cataclysmic collective trauma and trying to just sort through living day by day. So I'm really looking forward to the summer, and it feels like things are sort of incrementally getting better, but then then today's news is just it's everything. It's a very, very difficult time.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult time, and so it's hard to know exactly what happens. I think in the work, it's hard to make a clear accounting of it.
Yeah.
Right now, but I know there are shifts, and I know that all of the thinking and learning and doing with plantings, that's sort of where pun intended, the seed of the idea began at Madison Square Park in 2018, before this all happened, and also which is what motivated me to finally get some land, because my studio's on a second floor. It's really hard to make large work here. Well, it's not hard, but it's more of a challenge, I guess. Anyway, so that seed was planted in 2018, and it's really become an exciting way to reintroduce a material to my work now. I've sort of started getting into like soil science and how compost works, and I don't know exactly how that's going to play out in my work, but I have some opportunities coming up where I'm making outdoor projects and incorporating plantings and thinking about public access to the work, and those are heavily coming into play in a lot of ways in my thinking right now. But how we're gonna like metabolize this collective trauma, I don't exactly know. Aside from the fact that suddenly my work got a lot more colorful, which I just wasn't expecting. Because I don't count myself as like a painter necessarily. So that's been an interesting surprise. But I try to respond. I try to respond. I just try to respond to like whatever random intuitive things I may need in a day, So
yeah.
If my work's more colorful, so be it, I guess.
It's really interesting what you say about, your work is so focused on material, and, you grew up in the suburbs and then lived in a city. So this experience of being so close to the earth is really interesting, but also because so much of your work anyway sort of seems to teeter between some form of erosion or assimilation or deterioration, and there's a sort of balance in the work, a kind of push against gravity somehow. So it's kind of interesting to think about the natural world in that, because land art, there's always this question of work that comes from the land, of to what extent is it meant to be preserved, to what extent is it meant to erode and decay, like the states of entropy in living things. It's quite interesting. Is that coming into play in the way you're thinking about plants and soil and your work and public sculpture?
Absolutely. Thank you for making that link. It is unavoidable that an artist's environment is invariably going to, infiltrate into their thinking about the world and their materials that they're looking at. And I mean, really everything shifts. And I never really got this close to the earth I've been like a environmentalist all my life and vegetarian all my life, but I've never really understood soil chemistry, which seems like kind of boring, but it's totally blowing my mind in some very simple, basic ways. I think I share that with a lot of people right now. But when I lived in the suburbs, and that was when I was going to college and in high school, looking back, the materials that I was working with were things that I could find at like Joann Fabrics or Home Depot or whatever, like Lowe's or whatever the suburban environment had to offer. Right, I was working with AstroTurf and paper plates and these materials that sort of were easy and accessible. And then I kind of came into more traditional, let's say, sculpture materials or processes in grad school. Like I really resisted mixing a bucket of plaster when I was younger. I really wasn't interested in art that was made with any kind of traditional building material. And something totally switched in me when I don't know how, but I just really I was maybe kind of finally got the brilliance and the kind of the beauty of a bucket of plaster, this very simple ancient process where you take a powder and water, liquid, mix it together, and it creates a solid, and you have control over the form by mold making. It just really opened up the world to me. I think I've always been inclined to try to get to the root, to the root of how something is put together, not just what it's made of, but how it's organized, how it mechanically gets put together. I remember being really like, one of the things I wanted to really learn about was like, when I was younger, our car would break down so much. We had this like relationship with our car mechanic. We knew them pretty well, and I was fascinated by what was happening under the hood. I wanted to know how this thing ran. Of course, it was way beyond me, and it still is, to understand how cars put together. but the impulse to kind of break things down into their smaller units, and these things are kind of like massive abstractions, right? Like cars, and computers and ancient time-telling devices and spiral galaxies, like all of these abstractions that you can try to start to understand by progressively going layer by layer, part by part, and breaking it down into its most essential elements, right? And so it was really it was really an event in my mind, I guess, let's say, when I understood what I could really make with plaster, and actually welded a lot more before I did that. But yeah, all of my materials now in New York, and I've been here, I guess, the majority of my life. The materials that I use in most of my sculptures and my panels are actually pretty they're wide ranging, but they haven't changed too much for all this time. I guess the work has changed and I think evolved and looks very different piece to piece, but the materials remain just a conglomerate reflection of all of the materials around us that we live with, all of the building materials. You know, that, but mostly not in the natural world, right? Like construction materials, sculpture materials. So I like to reach back into this rich, civilization's rich material history and bring bronze together with polymers, kind of bridge these millennia of our material culture into one sculpture. So I use metal, I use all different kinds of metals, I use all different kind of gypsums, I use fiberglass, I use polystyrene that's found, or I don't use a lot of found material unless it's like raw found material, but cardboard, the gamut, really, concrete, but they're all, when you understand how triangles work and cantilevers work and how weights and structures, how to build, what you really appreciate, what we've accomplished and what we've and how complicated the world is and how it's constructed. I guess it's a little bit broad, but it's interesting to think that like a mold is used to make a cookie and a bridge, like a highway. If you understand how a mold is made, it's so much of our world is
derived from that.
Is derived from these very simple processes. And I find that so interesting and so challenging.
Well, your work as well, it's sort of, people always discuss the sort of archaeology of your work, which I think is also really a reference to, the fact that it's an iterative process, not only from work to work, but within the work itself. There are these like thin accumulated layers in your work, and it can seem quite fragile when you look at it. Like things can look very delicate, but it's actually very physically robust. Your work is you're very physical with your work.
Absolutely. It's taken some convincing, I think, for people to really believe that and again, it all depends on how I've kind of predetermined what materials to use, but then some of my materials can live outdoors because they do look fragile, but they're all of my work is built up in an additive way. It might take, cut and edit, but like I said, there's no found existing object. It's all kind of positive energy built, like it's built piece by piece. And I do have a tendency to build in small doses or small increments. So even with my drawings, my drawings have for so many years always been on transparent material. Like in some way I'm avoiding overcommitting that first plane to opacity.
Right.
Like somehow I want to be able to always see through everything. And each time I add a layer of material, it builds the form up slightly, right? But I don't go too far. I kind of build up the material just enough that it can hold up its own, be held up by its own strength, and so they look like they're on the brink of collapse, but they're actually. I am very physical with my work, and it's sort of a funny contradiction because of how they look, I guess. But it's also a real challenge for me, like when I'm now learning about gardens and seedlings, and because I have these big, meaty, strong hands that I'm not I don't need anybody to come and compliment my hands. I don't have any issues with my hands, but you know, I'm aggressive with how I work. So these little delicate seedlings it's harder for me to get that to kind of survive than it is to get like these big sculptures. But yeah, when I did the show at the park, I think it helped convince some people that, you know, because the Madison Square Park, I think averages like 60,000 people a day in their foot traffic pre-COVID. So, wow. You know, these things had to be built to withstand hurricane conditions, and they were built like buildings essentially. Although one of them was built, maybe it's a good time to share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. So one of them was built in a way that was very intuitive, much to the chagrin of the engineer. View present. So this is one of the walls at the park, and this is the first time, like I said, that I used plantings. Actually, I think that anyone had used natural plantings in the park, but I have to confirm that. And so this is what the reference was for one of these images. But yeah, I made this kind of hedged in room so you could get close to the work and see the surface, and it kind of invited a closer read. And this is the work that I said was built kind of intuitively. But you know, it's a conical form. So I was able to climb on it to reach, you know, to the top. So it was like a, you know, jungle gym, but right. It had to withstand, yeah, a lot of pressure and a lot of weathering, and that was it was a little complicated for the engineer to kind of, because I didn't have plans, right? Like I didn't have, right. I didn't know exactly. I was like, it's gonna be a mountain of some guy. So
the engineer's like, thanks.
Right, that sounds stable. I was like,
the other thing that really strikes me about your work is that it is very stable. It's very robust. It's very strong, even though it always seems to hover and sort of relish existing in that space where it's sort of teasing collapse somehow. And I think, again, that's that push against gravity. Your sculptures are often off the ground. You know, your wall panels are, there's gravity enacted on the sort of paint polymer as it drips. I think someone once said your work was between ruin and regeneration. And what I really like is this idea that you quite like destroying parts of your work. You know, I'd read that you said it's really easy for me to completely annihilate. It's something I really value. I'm really able to fix anything. Nothing is that delicate. I'm very aggressive with the way things are built and very hands-on. If I break something, I know how to fix it. Sometimes I break it intentionally. And I like that kind of...
that was me, yeah. Just right.
Yeah, that sort of destructive... you know, it's the confidence in your own ability to create, essentially.
You make something, right? Unless it's a child, you know how it's made. So you're not really risking, I don't know. And like, what am I making this for if not to like see it end up the way that I want? I don't know. Like, I don't have, my studio's always been my safe space, right? It's always been where I can do whatever I want and no one has a say. And I don't have to collaborate or play by anyone's rules. I can do whatever I feel like. You know, if I want to come in and just scratch at a piece of paper for 8 hours, that's nobody's business, you know? Like if I want to like break off a limb of my sculpture, because I feel like it, that's an important part of the work. Like my feelings are part of the work, right? So yeah, I mean, I've learned since that like seedlings are delicate, but I have to figure out how I would incorporate something, you know, that obviously has a life of its own. And in all of my materials, they don't come alive until whatever I put them together, and even, you know, then that's when I guess they might be animated. But Yeah, I guess gravity is kind of a consistent, well, it's a core, it's a fundamental, definitive, problem, concern, whatever of sculpture, right?
Right.
Like gravity is the thing that makes a thing. I mean, it makes everything. I mean, we can't overstate the significance of gravity, I guess.
Right, but painters get a different license with gravity, for
Exactly.
instance.
Yeah, and I always feel very jealous that they can kind of just like imagine these things, soaring, and so I do have a little bit of, I talked about that, having a little bit of painter envy. In fact, I use a lot of paintings when I make sculpture as a kind of like as a roadmap to how I might lay out certain components of a sculpture. And I try to cheat gravity as much as possible, I think. And a lot of my older work, I think, especially when one of the first pieces that I think that I feel like was one of my most, let's say, pivotal works for me when I was younger is this upside down cathedral that's standing on it. I'll show a picture.
Oh yeah, I love this work.
It's an old, I think I made it when I was, I think I just turned 24. And so I wasn't thinking straight. I was thinking, but yeah, I made this piece, and this was like my first, let's say, my first real argument with my first real-ish time that I took very serious. Well, that's not true. I've been trying to mess with gravity for a while, but something came together on this piece, and it's maybe the most illustrative example of my problem with gravity. But yeah, I also try to use it in terms of in how I make those panel works. I'll just go through some old slides.
Yeah, this is nice.
This is, yeah, another kind of broken. I originally wanted this piece called Tower of Infinite Problems to be standing upright, but it just wasn't cooperating. So I made it into two parts, and here's another kind of gravity. I don't say defying, because I'm actually using gravity using sculpture. But yeah, even in, like I was saying, the panels, which came way later in my work, in my career. Let me zoom through some of those. Here's another kind of.
Yeah, this is to your point about blending material.
Yeah, that was the first bronze. Yeah, gravity's factored into a lot of the thinking behind how these work. So this is where
you can see your confidence in the material growing, through these works. It's really interesting as the layering gets more and more intricate.
Yeah, when I made this work, this was where I figured out this experiment finally, and I got it to work, where I could kind of make these suspended drips in midair of color as sort of like, this sort of like super colorful, pastiche, like trying to make every color I can find and make form with it. And then when I learned how to do that, when I figured that out, I realized this is now a way that I can speak to the history of painting like I have never really done before. So I made this inset wall work. I realized, I can make pictorial forms now.
Yeah.
So it kind of opened up that. So yeah, so then I started making these, and this was like, I don't know, maybe like 7 years ago now, where I started building up the images and with little drips of paint. But they aren't paint, I should say. I say paint, but they're not. It's not paint. It's gypsum. It's plaster, essentially. And it's built in layers in reverse. So I kind of paint into, again, a mold. It's a very sculptural process
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, you know, came from my sculptures, came from my sculpture materials.
And the forms are
come back to you.
The forms are so they reference, you know, there's like a lot of triangular forms, there's a lot of conical forms, like the references to classical sculpture and classical, like Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have a lot of references back through art history. I was actually looking at some of your early drawings when you were a child. Your grandmother was a painter, right, who said that if you could draw hands and people, you were really an artist. So you tried very hard to do that, and some of your early drawings are so virtuoso in their realism. And I read somewhere that you said, I was trying to be Jan van Eyck, and and you can see like the layering and yeah, but they're so realistic. And I was thinking, gosh, they're so different. And then I realized they're not really, because it's the same sort of approach to, there isn't one moment that makes any of those works. It's just a series of decisions that have made small actions.
I mean, the reverence for, you know, for these old master, and it goes cross cultures. Like, you know, I'm obsessed with, you know, Persian miniatures and Islamic miniatures and Northern Renaissance, you know, the Flemish masters, just as much, you know, because I am a product of both cultures, right, essentially. Right. And I feel like they're both mine, and I'm an artist, so I really feel like everything, you know, is mine within a certain, gets kind of complicated, but my entrance is the material, the way that it's painted. You know, I don't hang on to the story in the painting as much. Like, I'm less interested in the religious narrative, but you know, these religious narratives, made these works possible in a sense, right? They were commissioned. There's so much. I mean, I studied art history as an undergrad, and it's such an incredible way to understand a moment, you know, through art, to understand what was happening at the time. And I think my sweet spot is sort of like early Ottoman, like I'm all things medieval. So my love of that material and that time and those paintings is old. It's from, you know, when I was like a teenager. And I felt like, you know, when you're making art when you're a teenager, it's very easy, especially when you have the facility to draw realistically for people to respond. And so that's what you think, you know, until I learned about contemporary art, or until, you know, it didn't like crack open that really changed my world, I think, when you know, because I was just resigned to being like whatever, just like a cartoon, figure out something in the arts, you know, whether it's cartoons or whatever I thought was art at the time, or an art career. Like, I didn't know. But yeah, it's a whole process, but it wasn't healthy. I always also say, or maybe it did get me through some very, you know, difficult years, but it was definitely rooted in a lot of compulsive behavior. Like my drawings were, I would work on a tiny drawing like this big for 4 or 5 months as a 13 to 14-year-old. That's intense, I think.
There's a lot of that though in young girls, you know, a kind of a moment of almost OCD, like this sort of compulsive, obsessive behavior as a kind of passage through, you know, of control through puberty, a means of exerting control through a confusing time in your life. Like, I remember I used to count obsessively, and it drove everybody nuts. So I would just be counting steps, counting everything. I just counted all the time. And I had all these like rituals around counting, and it was just a strange thing that I did.
No, I get that. I relate to that very much. I think it was a response in some ways to other pressures that you can't, and art does that, right? Like it's a way, like it's that safe space where you can drown in your thoughts with permission from the world, you know, if you're lucky enough to have that.
If you've carved that out.
If you've carved it out, yeah. And you know, I wasn't really allowed to go out too much, so I stayed at home and drew and read, and it got me through. But it was, looking back, it's sort of like re-traumatizing to see, like, oh my God, like, I remember how hard it was to make it through that drawing, and how much I beat myself up over its imperfections, and you know, how tortured it was. And it was so liberating to just finally take all of those little tiny microscopic marks and explode them into massive sculptures. It was like they turned inside out. You know, now I make these room-sized installations that you can walk through, and they're not unrelated in a way to the, you know, to the power of projection that I was creating, I guess, or drowning in when I was making these small drawings. And you're kind of evaluating every nook and cranny, and kind of turning the corner in the image and imagining what could it look like behind that rock, you know, or behind that, whatever you're trying to get to the DNA of the thing. It was as close as I could get to these images from long and far away, you know, like these incredibly esoteric historical objects that I can't see, you know, you can only project so far. And, you know, all of that kind of restraint and constraint that girls feel, especially immigrant girls, maybe especially, you know, girls who are raised in a Muslim household in a very hyper-Christian environment in the, you know, Midwest in America. And you know, those things found their way out when I discovered that I could weld and make huge spaces if I wanted to. And, you know, a lot of my early work were very like womb-like. I was really into like Andrea Zitel's like kind of interior spaces, and Ernesto Neto was just in the Carnegie International. So my undergrad years and Sarah Z's work were very like having the chance to learn about installation art and sculpture. Once I found sculpture, that was it, because I felt like that gave me the widest net, the widest world, the widest medium that I could kind of navigate the world through, you know. Like
I remember this moment years and years ago. I was at Deer Beacon, and I was looking at the Richter gray paintings that have that reflective plexiglass surface on them, and I realized as I moved around, you know, for anyone who hasn't visited, it's a room where there are a series of these works, and so you walk around the room, and I realized that every time I was walking up to a work, I could see myself reflected, and it made me uncomfortable because I didn't want to see myself reflected. But I also started realizing I was always standing in exactly the same place. And so then I was like, why aren't I standing in the middle of this work? Why am I always going off to the side of it? Why aren't I approaching these works like front and center? So then I went around the room again in a different way and approached them from the middle. And then I remember a dad came running in, a kid came screeching in. And the dad said, you know, what do you tell him about minimalism? And I said, tell him to change his stance, like just stand somewhere different. And I realized, oh, wow, you could do that with the world. Like you could imagine your problems were sculptures and like walk around them and look at them from a different position. And so it was really like a moment when I realized that you could make anything 3D in a way. It's just how you kind of think about it.
Where you are relative to it.
Yeah, just change your relative position. Which
beautiful metaphor.
Yeah, it was just this moment when I was like, oh, I think I understand minimalism now. And you said a quote, this idea of taking up space. You have a really great quote here, which it's a little long. I'm going to read it all out because I thought I couldn't figure out where to cut it. You said, I think that because my business is space, thinking about space and building in space, I found that I have no issue taking up space when it comes to my work. I've noticed that in so many other arenas, not just in my life, but in the lives of many women, it's a hard thing to do, to take up space. Women in our world, in our culture, and in most cultures are asked to take up less space. And I think that when you're accustomed to shrinking and being asked to take up less physical space, lose weight, be small, speak quietly, speak less, take up less space on a train, take up less psychological space, give more space to others around you. In every sense, women are asked to get smaller and be smaller. So when you're asked to be small in so many different spheres of your life, you find an outlet. And I've been fortunate in finding a way that feels comfortable for me. So I have no issue making large work. I like that kind of physical assertion of self over, universe, really.
I love that. Self over universe. Yeah, you have to sometimes. Yeah, I think that was in, I think that was, I was asked to comment on maybe Linda Benglis's, I don't remember what that was for. It was a while ago, and people were just starting to talk about, not just starting people, but talking about it for decades, but about, the importance of taking up space in the workplace, right? Like there were, and we talked about that once, Charlotte. But yeah, it's like I said, the studio is like a safe space. It took me a long time to really be able to understand that part of it, that that there was something exciting me about building worlds, right? About building something that my body could inhabit. And it actually helped me gain, I think it always helps me kind of gain perspective and actually feel within a world to make these things that are so big. They didn't dominate me, right? They didn't they were open, right? They were all of my early large scale works are very diaphanous, or you can kind of, because again, everything's built up little piece by little piece. There's very little space that's completely enclosed. If there's a pedestal, I puncture through it. If there's a figure, it's just the skim surface of a figure. You can see inside. Or if there's, there's all these different ways that I want to make interior spaces available, and that I'm thinking about building with membranes. And when I really started getting into my materials in grad school, I spent a lot of time thinking about topology and the kind of math of stretching surfaces, and how interesting it is that there's a math equation that might, equate the globe and a small donut, it's about these kind of continuously that surfaces that you can kind of always connect through and navigate through without kind of falling off. Anyway, so I realized that a lot of the things that I build are planar or like a drip, like a horizontal form or vertical form, or some combination, where that's how I start to slowly jig up an interior space or an imagined, and I say that because the earliest, the spaces that have left the deepest impression in my mind, maybe are not going to be very surprising to most people, but when I toured, did my backpacking tour of Europe, and I visited a lot of church interiors, cathedrals, and realized the relationship between grottos, and the Latin term for with these interior spaces, and caves. And my early memory of being one of my early trips back home to the Middle East, where I visited Rajrita, was like a cave in Lebanon that was super. In caves, there's a mythology are always so interesting to me. And then also Belden Village Mall in Ohio, these interiors that are just you feel so small in, and it gives you this sense of this depth of history and also smallness of self, right? So it's interesting
Right.
that you said about like the self and the versus the universal. It's a conflict that's always kind of being enacted in your mind, right? Like
Yeah.
at all times you're yourself, but you're in the world, you're watching the news, you're on Insta, you know, it's a
But there's something reassuring perhaps about vastness in a way, you know, in the same way, you know, I write a lot about the art market, and one of the phenomena of the art market is this thing called the Veblen effect, that people are reassured by expense. You know, so there comes a moment if you're an art collector where, or a buyer of anything, of a luxury-ish good, you know, it's actually better if it's more expensive because people are like, oh, it's worth it.
right.
It's reassuringly expensive. So perhaps there's something sort of reassuringly,
Expansive.
yeah, you know, like if you're on an airplane, it's so big, there's nothing you can do. You know, there's no personal responsibility in that instance because it's larger than you. It's like your mortality isn't something you have to deal with because it's clearly out of your hands, you know?
And
Perhaps there's
yeah,
something.
yeah, imagining it being, I love being in big, open, expansive space. Like I love being on top of a mountain or on a hill. That's my, you know, a few people say, are you a mountain person or a beach person? I'm a mountain person. I want to be up high, watching, seeing as far as I can, you know, it feels safe. And that's why, you know, citadels are built on top of mountains. And the
Yeah.
Citadel of Aleppo is like one of the oldest historic structured monument cities in the world. And that was always, you know, it's like it's this core part of our civilization. And so many stories begin in mountains, and so many,
Yeah.
the whole Islamic faith um, began by mountains, you know, by actually the angel Gabriel coming to recite Iqra, like the read, asking Muhammad to read, you know, was the first imperative that was given to the prophet. And it was a revelation that came from a cave in a mountain, right? And so it's
so funny because your Madison Square Garden, you know, you said to the engineer, I just want to build a mountain.
Yeah, I still want to build mountains. I've been building mountains since yeah, I learned about installation art. I immediately started making mountains and caves. The first thing I made, actually deleted it from my presentations. I don't talk about my old work so much anymore, but I made a paper plate cave in a room. And but yeah, I find those expansive, that relationship of going from a protected space to an expansive space, like just a quintessential, you know, kind of conflict or something that we navigate or negotiate in our daily lives and our human experience, you know, just that extreme shift of scale. And I feel like I work really well in extreme modes, like, and that's something sculpture also offers, that you can get as close to the thing, you know, and see like this miniature little decibel of material, right? Just like a mark on the sculpture. You can zoom back and it feels like a whole distant universe. And I mean, immigrants are constantly having to think about distant worlds, right? Like, you know, it's the phenomenon of like ruin porn, right? And like these ancient monuments, are like, get so fascinated because of the ruin and over time, like abandoned castles and these things. It's a whole like it's a whole psychological terrain that that I think resonates with people a lot. But there's so much more to it. I think there's so much more to, there's something so elemental to kind of trying to find out how wide the scale is, like what, you know, that it's incredible to me that, you know, that string theory is a totally different science than like you know, these microscopic that there's so many there. I mean, just think about, you know, how many microbes are in like a drop of water, and how big are you know, these things, like you can't understand them. It's like, it's annoying. Like you're like, it's impossible for our brains, we just are too limited to actually compute. And that stuff infuriates me and sort of also like excites me. But I think sculpture lets me kind of play with these extremes of scale.
Yeah, and
Large
negotiate
and
that.
extremely small. Yeah, negotiate that inside and outside, and large and extremely small, and yeah.
One of your former professors, Gregory Volk, who incidentally described you as a cherished former student who was exemplary and adventurous, wrote about your work that you have long negotiated your way between two vastly different worlds, the West and Islam, heartland America and Syria, box store fast food, high school football, family car Ohio, and Syria, both ancient and modern, the seat of multiple civilizations with millennia's worth of historical remnants and architectural traces. This negotiation is also essential for her art. And I want to talk to you about that, but through a slightly different lens, which is that you get asked a lot about your heritage and about being an Arab American. You and I discussed this a little bit when we spoke last, and it's the idea of the irritation of that there's some just degree of racism in some of those questions, especially that you were asked in your early career, and sexism. And you said that you had this sense that you were watching a lot of white guys being able to talk about art in the purest of senses. They were allowed to talk about material and form and process and matter, and you were being asked about personality and personal life and identity. But then you said you kind of understood the impulse. It's as if you had a favorite musician, you'd want to know the context of their life. You'd want to know as much as you could about that person. How do you, that still seems like an active negotiation. Where are you in your thinking on that negotiation now?
I tend towards a lot more calm and forgiveness around the cure. It depends on how, I've lived through, the 90s in Ohio, and witnessed in a lot of bigotry. It's not, but at the same time, like I guess they say passing. So I don't, I can kind of be like a little bit stealthy.
Mm-hmm.
People don't necessarily know my experience, my life, they don't necessarily know that I'm Arab, although I'm totally an Arab, but people's perceptions of what an Arab looks like is I've learned
Mm-hmm.
from back when is like very different. And my skin is not, so I've benefited from sort of a certain amount of privilege, but I know what it's like to come from a minority religion or minority, to be in a minority, I guess, just to put it very simply.
Yeah.
And to have another language and another, it's of course it's meaningful. And when you're young, and I still, of course, like I can talk about sculpture, material, form, to the end of time. Like I don't ever really need to talk about myself, my story, but it's also sort of curious to me, like, because and I sort of said this before, like there's probably, maybe less so these days, but when I was first coming out of school, like it was probably a bit of a statistical anomaly that I was, welding. I was 21, and Syrian girl from Ohio, like making big sculptures. Like this is a little, yeah, it's not so many of us, I guess, back then, but even just like a woman welding, is kind of like novel, right, for a lot of people, even still, strangely. But it's I guess I've kind of, because your response changes. So I was so much more distraught, and so much more, because I would watch my friends from school be put into these kind of like sculpture shows. Maybe it would be in the same collection, and they would go into the show about about material and form, just the sculpture of today. And then I would be put into Middle Eastern artist show by the same, and I would just be like, well, it just felt, no one wants to be reduced to no one wants that. Like it helps nobody.
Yeah.
So I sort of started to realize that it was useful and helpful for maybe myself and others, for me to just yes, I was born in Syria. I'm an Arab. I speak Arabic. Like I grew up as a Muslim. Like I felt like it was maybe I just felt like it helps for people to broaden their understanding of what those assumptions they might have had coming into what is an Arab woman, what does a Muslim woman look like. So it was nice to surprise. It's always nice to surprise people, right? That like I'm a normal person, like I remember, I don't know, like that I don't know. I mean, this again, times have changed so much. Every week I feel like I'm like, wow, I can't believe people are saying that in public now. But because I remember a time when we ate hummus every day at home, and then I started to see it at the grocery store. People call it hummus. And I was like, pita bread, like that's just bread. Now everyone calls it pita bread, but like that's hummus, that's bread. So to see people starting, I mean, it's extremely slow in some ways, but I lived, pre 9/11 to now, and have seen the world around me have a total, go through wars in the Middle East and the horrific crisis in Syria, as sort of gotten people curious. And so I kind of standing outside of myself started to also be curious, like, well, how does this generate, have I carried generational trauma as an immigrant? Like how does that manifest? I don't know. Again, it's not something that's so easy to
anatomize.
But I'm just a lot more patient with the question. I'm actually, depending on who's asking, and most often people are very well-meaning and very curious, and I just rather, because also there's a lot of perceptions about what Ohioans are like. And for example, I was always very determined for people to know that I grew up in Ohio. I'm not a refugee, so get your story straight. So the more I put my story out there, the straighter I was going to get, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's also the inverse thing where certainly I understand that I was the first, and for many people, and still to this day, sometimes the first Syrian they meet, the first Arab they met, the first Muslim they met. And that was, growing up in Ohio, no one, I was it. I was everyone's, friend from that area. No one had, and there weren't, this is just, because of certain immigration policies, the different, different patterns, and we happened to get in to the country, and so randomly ended up, Northeast Ohio. And so I feel like people are curious, and I don't blame them. I think, it just depends on how, there's so many wonderful people that I grew up with that were very open and interested and supportive, and willing to see me as a much more dimensional person than the media had me out to be.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's all of the time we have for my questions. I'm going to open it up now to our audience. I have a question here. Please use the Q&A function. Anybody who wants to send a question, we have a few minutes. So the first question here is, where is the location of your art in Embassy Piece? How was your experience creating it, and did you work on site?
Okay. Yes. Let me pull that work up, because
that'd be great.
Even talk about that. My work from the art and embassies went to Kosovo. So another, not unfamiliar to me to make a work about or for a place this time that I haven't visited before. So I had to find a way in that was interesting to me. And what I learned was, I'm going to do share screen, was I found this beautiful bridge in Kosovo that had that they thought was built sometime in the early Ottoman era, so in the 15th century, and I think the Ottoman Empire was like very late 13th century. So this was at a time when the world was opening up to East and West, and of course, bridges are obviously like a representation of a kind of cultural link, or connection between two places. And I called this Words from Mountains. Obviously, I've talked about my obsession with mountains. It seemed appropriate that I would make this as a diptych. The bridge itself, it's a stone bridge, but it's sort of asymmetrical. And surrounding it are these massive mountains, this span of mountains that, makes the bridge actually look very, very small in comparison, and very like quaint. So this is the work. Oh, I guess I'm sorry, I didn't make this a bigger. So yeah, I kind of talked to them, and I did some research, and I just kept it sort of simple, responded to something that I could understand from a distance, and think about how what words might have echoed through the mountains from one side to the other, and think about how, again, I'm always interested in like trade patterns, and the history of the Silk Road, for example, and so that's where that work came from. Thank you for the question, because I would have otherwise forgot to show that work. That's kind of what I'm here for.
Okay, so next question. There's a haunting quality to your work. Can you talk a bit about that?
About it being haunted? It probably is haunted. I don't know. It's hard to comment on like an interpretive quality to my work from the outside, or from the, yeah, I guess it could be haunted. I've certainly made work that speaks about various allegories, or I talk about Gradiva, which is kind of like a spirit. She shows up in a lot of my work, but that's kind of a narrative. That's a narrative ghost. Haunted, yeah, it's totally haunted. I don't know. I kind of would be like more curious to hear what they think about it. I mean, maybe because a lot of my work, I think, feels like it's kind of coming from an event or an action. So possibly there's this kind of residual element of something that was performed or enacted on, or crushed, or supported, or buttressed, or so that yeah, I'm not a terribly spiritual, I'm not a religious person, and I come and go with spirituality, but because I think my work kind of it fills that all up in some ways, but
right.
But I mean, I do love a good ghost story.
Who doesn't? Okay. Yeah. So I think we have time for just one more question, which is a simple one. What are you working on? Oh, I have actually two more. Okay, so let's just do this. A question here. How do you consider lighting your work? In the gallery, outdoors, in the making of?
I've never used light as a material per se. So in some ways, I don't consider it too much as I'm building. I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit old school about like, I don't know. I'm about like sculpture. How do I put this? I just haven't deliberately used it as a material in my work.
Right.
But of course, when it's exhibited, then I have to consider that. But to be honest, that's the sort of the extent of it. It ends up being something that kind of shows up at the end at install, or something that, of course, I take into consideration to make the work look good. But I've never explicitly used it as a material. That's probably the best way I can put it.
Okay, and one final question. What are you working on next?
Always the best question. I am bouncing between a number of sculptures, but I think the thing what I'm mostly what unites them all, let's say, is a working with bronze that is lightweight, that tries to take the mass and weight out of the material, that tries to somehow make it more diaphanous or something. I'm trying to make a bronze smoke of bronze. I don't know. I'm sort of working with bronze and other more contemporary materials all in one object.
I can't wait to see it. When will you, when is it for a show, or is it just what you're working on in the studio?
It probably is for a show, but I haven't committed it to any, because there's like 3-4 sculptures that at this point, one of the things that kind of I came away with after COVID was that if I wasn't going to live my life based on deadlines as much. So if it's not done and I want it to have 4 more months instead of 2 more months, I'm gonna give it 4 more months, and it'll show up at the show when it's ready, I guess. So I've never really done that before too much, but yeah, I have. Okay, but like on the calendar, I have a show at the Henry in October in Seattle. I'll probably have some work at Armory Art Fair, and I have work up at the Momentary right now in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I have some outdoor, and there are other things next year that just stay tuned, I guess.
Right. Okay, perfect. Well, we look forward to them. Thank you, Diana, so much. Thank you to our audience for attending. And thank you to everybody at the Hirshhorn and at Art and Embassies.
Thank you all. Thanks, Charlotte. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Bye.